I kind of say to people, look, we're more like a satnav. So you set off from Swindon, and you're going to Glasgow, and you look at the thing, and it says it's going to take 7 hours and 41 minutes. Well, you know, with probability 1, it's not going to be 7 hours and 41 minutes. And in a sense, when people say the OBR is always wrong, I say, yeah, of course we are. What do you expect? You know, when you set off from Swindon, you know you're not going to get there 7 hours, 41 minutes later.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I am Tim Shipman, the political editor of The Spectator, and today I'm delighted to be joined after the budget by Professor David Miles, who's Professor of Economics at Imperial College London and also a member of the Committee of the Office for Budget Responsibility, the watchdog, which casts its judgment on the budget. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, you guys find yourselves always at the sort of heart of the story on days like this, almost as much as the Chancellor herself. And that was never more so yesterday when, for the first time ever, the entire budget was published shortly before the Chancellor stood up. Can you just tell us what happened with that?
This is a very serious issue. It's hugely unfortunate. That's an understatement, if anything. We've launched an investigation which begins right now. It's going to be overseen by Baroness Sarah Hogg with the input and help of Kieran Martin, who's formerly Chief Executive of the National Cybersecurity Centre. I think they'll get to the bottom of what happened. I'm not clear on what happened and how someone got access to our assessment of the budget and the fiscal and economic outlook some 45 minutes before the Chancellor actually stood up. But this is serious. We're going to find out what happened and what needs to happen now to make sure this cannot happen again.
And presumably, if someone is identified as responsible, there'll likely be some kind of disciplinary action.
Well, we'll see what the investigation comes up with.
But the focus is on stopping it occurring again, presumably.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's a very helpful update. Thank you. Look, you guys sit in judgment to a degree. You're part of the process. What's your assessment of this budget then? Just give us the sort of big picture here, because there was a lot of talk beforehand about the size of the black hole, as we call it, the gap between what the government's getting in and what it needs to do to conform to the Chancellor's own rules. Just give us the raw numbers. How big was the black hole in the end?
Well, we make an assessment, so-called pre-measures forecast, of what we think the outlook would be if there were no new measures on spending, on taxes in the budget. And that was that most of the rather limited headroom that the government had after the spring statement back in March, most of that had gone. There was a tiny sliver, but essentially close to zero.
And that at the time had been 9.9 billion, I think.
Correct. It had been essentially 10 billion back in March. That had pretty much gone as a result of several different moving parts. I mean, one was we made an assessment that the likely long-run trend rate of growth of productivity in the UK is a bit lower than we had thought before. I can talk about that judgment later if you wish. That's unhelpful. That made the headroom swing into negative territory. It was offset to a very large extent by somewhat higher wage growth and inflation, which actually brought in more revenue without the government having to make any changes, any budget changes. There was just going to be more revenue coming in because of that. But on the other side of that, there was more spending as a result of higher inflation because of the indexation of various bits of benefits, and also because interest rates were a little bit higher, and that increases debt interest as you look down the road. So lots of different moving parts. The net effect was that the headroom had more or less been reduced to a sliver. And then, of course, it's up to the Chancellor to decide, which of the many different ways you can address that situation to try and build up again headroom, which was clearly the intention of the government.
Yeah. I mean, the number I heard was about 6 billion, ultimately, was what she needed to plug.
Well, to get back to the 10 billion number,
right?
That's right. That was of the order of 6 billion. But I think there was Clearly a desire and a realization
further than
that 10 billion was it wasn't it's not a trivial amount of money, but given the uncertainty, the volatility, looking 4 years down the road, it wouldn't take a whole lot to, in a sense, be blown off course by 10 billion and more.
So the number's now 22 billion of headroom, I think. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what's your assessment of that in terms of the grand scheme of things? It's obviously a lot bigger. It's more than twice the size of 10. But in terms of how much greater security does 20 give you than 22 than 10?
One way to answer that question is to say, let's suppose that there were no further changes in government policy. They stuck to what they said they were going to do, but you got the swings and arrows of outrageous fortune between now and 4 years down the road, which could blow you in either direction. So it could turn out that 20 billion margin, if you will, or headroom, turns into a much bigger number because we get some good news for the first time in a very long time in the UK, or we get some bad news and that would blow through probably 20 billion. And one way to assess how much 20 billion is to say, without any further changes in policy for 4 years, what's the probability, given the kind of volatility we've seen in the past in the UK, what's the probability that you're the right side of your target 29-30 financial year? And the answer is about 60%. So it's better than tossing a coin. It's not a whole lot better. Because in a way, that's a pessimistic assessment to some extent of the chances of being on the right side. Because if things do go awry and we get some more bad news, and that 20 billion looks like it's coming down, the government, of course, has got several budgets between now and then to try and correct course. So the 60% probability number, which doesn't sound like an awful lot of security, is a number of what would happen if they didn't change direction, but actually they've got time to change direction if things move in a bad direction.
And how much of that assessment is down to the way the Chancellor structured the finances? Because a lot of people have noted the fact that a lot of the spending comes very quickly and a lot of the tax rises are backloaded. Some of them appear to be coming in an election year, which instinctively those of us that follow politics regard as pretty unlikely to be happening. So how much of that sort of percentage assessment that must be part of your calculation, presumably?
Yes, in a sense, what matters for the fiscal targets, and this has been true for quite a while, is in some ways a sort of snapshot of where you are at a point 4 years down the road. So in a sense, it doesn't matter if you get the pain in early and then do a bit more spending, or switch it the other way around. If you stick to what you say you're going to do, what matters is the place you have got to 4 years down the road. Now, you're right that the sort of tax raising measures are pretty back end loaded. They come through in 2028, 2029, some come through in 2030. And more of the extra spending comes through early. So there's more borrowing in the early years, in fact, for several years. And then the tax rises really kick in at the end, and there's some spending cuts. And that turns the situation into one in which, on the central forecast, there's about 22 billion of margin at that particular point in the future.
Yeah, but it looks a little bit like the Chancellor's hoping that things get better and then she won't have to impose those tax rises. Is that your read on it?
Well, that might happen, absolutely. And, we get very big swings one way or the other. I mean, we've had a load of really bad swings in recent years. I mean, who saw COVID coming? And UK GDP falls 10% in 2020. The government steps in with, rescue packages for people that can't get to work, furlough scheme. So you get a huge drop in tax revenue and a huge increase in government spending, and it blows a massive hole in any projections that the Office for Budget Responsibility have made. Now, if you get the sort of flip side of that, hard to imagine, perhaps something as positive as the flip side of that, but if we got some good news over the next 4 years...
If it was that good, in reverse...
That 22 billion could turn into a much bigger number, in which case the government would be in an easier position than it was going into this budget of, well, we've got some spare cash now. We could cut some taxes, we can do lots of things. There's lots of things you can do when you get that spare money.
I mean, the government says its top priority is growth, but your numbers in this are pretty, make pretty grim reading for people who if we were to genuinely think that that was the government's top priority, you might think they might have done more on growth. What's your assessment of the growth picture going forward?
I mean, it's more muted than we thought in March. That's largely because we've made this assessment about the underlying rate of productivity growth. So that isn't sort of directly linked to any immediate policies of this budget. That was more a reflection of, now that we're far enough past the noise that was generated by COVID and the energy price increase, it's time to take a longer look at whether we've been a bit more optimistic than the evidence suggests on productivity, and that's the judgment we came to. So that's the main reason, actually, why growth, the average rate of growth of GDP is like 1.5 now, and it was about 1.8 or so back in March. That difference is pretty much all the productivity downgrade. Now, then there's a bunch of measures in the budget that in isolation might have been somewhat helpful. There's a bit more capital spending, but there's inevitably negative effects when you raise this much more taxation. It's virtually impossible to raise substantial amounts of more taxation without having some negative effects on people's incentive either to work, to save, to invest. So there are some negatives, some positives. We thought they broadly washed out, and so we're just left with, in terms of GDP growth, just the impact of the downgrade in the productivity assessment.
And what about more specifically on the fact that the main feature of this budget, really, given that to go back to that dread phrase, the black hole, it wasn't quite as large as some people had predicted in advance. So it seems that the Chancellor made a positive decision to put up income tax to spend money on benefits. What's the growth effect of piling money into benefits at sort of 10, 11, 12 billion pounds in the way that she's done?
Well, I think it depends what kind of benefits and what people's reaction is. Some people will get a bit more than they otherwise might have. And for some people, that will generate, incentives, to work more or less, depending on quite which way you change the welfare system. We thought that over this horizon, to the extent that there were negative effects, they were not large enough to feel confident about to make an explicit downgrade for those things. I mean, some of the welfare stuff, in a way, we're already known about, because back in March, there was some, as you will well remember, I mean, a package of measures to reduce, PIP and disability benefits. That was reversed quite soon after the budget. We count that as a new measure because it came after March. So that bit of the increase in welfare spending, in a sense, had already been factored in people's behaviour.
Let's talk about this productivity review then a little bit. You've sort of talked about why you did it. I mean, the Chancellor seems pretty irritated that you did it now rather than a year ago when she might have had a cleaner slate to work with. Why do it now? Why not do it last year?
Well, I think it's one of those things where whenever you do it, whenever you make a judgment, if it turns out to be to lower it a bit, it's not going to go very well with the government of the day, because it takes away on our forecast anyway, some revenue, and who wants that to happen? I mean, I think the reason now rather than a couple of years ago is something I mentioned a while ago, which was what we're trying to do is measure the underlying rate of growth of productivity. Measured productivity is affected by all kinds of things, short-term cyclical fluctuations in the economy. I mean, things like COVID. That will cause gyrations in measured productivity, but actually have very little to do with the trend rate of growth of productivity. So you've got to be able to step back after you've got some big shocks and wait for the dust for those to have settled to confidently reach some judgment about what you now think the trend is. And the energy price shock is only the end of 2022 that really comes through. So that's only a couple of years ago. COVID has had ongoing effects. Maybe they're largely now washed out. So it was only really in the last, maybe couple of years that you get a better read after the dust has settled after these huge shocks about what's happening to productivity. And it appeared that there doesn't seem in the recent couple of years to have been much of a bounce back after those shocks. And we, to some extent, been thinking that was going to come through. It now looks like it's not coming through. And now seemed the time, with enough elapse of a period after those shocks to be able to more confidently read something about the trend.
What's wrong with the British workforce then, David? I mean, our productivity is pretty dire in this country. Why are we worse than France and Germany in those places? And has it changed since COVID? Is there a tendency of, people frankly don't want to work as much as they did, or they're working from home more and that makes them less productive? Do you have a view on any of that?
The productivity judgment is really a judgment about output per hour worked.
Yeah.
So if some people, for whatever reason, are dropping out of the labour force and not working, they don't actually show up in the productivity numbers. They show up in that's a change in the size of the labour force. So in a sense, a different set of issues. So the productivity judgment is what's happening over time to output per hour worked. And in some ways, it's one of the most difficult things to predict because over the long run, the drivers of increases in standards of living, real output per hour that people work, are to do with innovations and the rate in which they're rolled out across the country and are reflected in work practices. And you can't predict what hasn't yet been invented. And the history of productivity over a very long period, and we produced a 50-odd page report on all this, which came out at the same time as the EFO yesterday.
Which, regrettably, I haven't had a chance to read all of yet.
No. I don't blame you. Life is short and it's a long report. We look back over long periods, and there are pretty clearly eras of higher and lower productivity growth, which at the time were very difficult to predict. So at the risk of boring you with a story from ancient history, productivity growth in the UK had been really strong between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and about the 1870s, 1880s. I mean, extremely strong. And then, for some reason that was not well understood at the time, in the 1880s, for like 10 years, there didn't seem to be any productivity growth at all. And there was no shortage of people at that time who were saying, well, this is the end of productivity growth. We've discovered everything that there is to be discovered, steam engines, all that stuff. There isn't anything left. We should now get used to zero productivity growth, which had been the norm, as far as one could tell from the archaeology of economic history, between about the year 2000 BC and about 1700. There had been virtually no productivity growth. So in 1880, there were lots of wise people at the time who were saying, this is now the new normal. There will be no productivity growth. And they were spectacularly wrong because between about 1900 and the outbreak of the First World War, productivity grew again very fast.
Yep.
And you get a load of new discoveries of stuff. And so it's intrinsically really quite hard to be confident about where this might be going. I mean, one example of why it's difficult right now, although we all know that AI is quite a big deal in some ways, it's really yet to be adopted in a meaningful economic sense to change productivity in the economy. But who knows? I mean, over the next 5-10 years, it could transform various sectors of the economy. We try to take account of things like that, but you always end up with a judgment about something that is extremely uncertain.
But you don't think there's something inherently problematic about Britain compared with comparable countries? I
mean, we've had weaker investment for many years relative to most other rich countries. I mean, that's undoubtedly a factor.
And that implies less tech generally, does it?
Yeah, because if you just increase the amount of, if you like, capital goods and goods that people have to work with to produce output, then their output per hour will tend to go up quite a lot. I mean, it obviously completely transformed agricultural production in the UK in the past. And if you do less of that stuff, other things equal, there's going to be a bit less growth in productivity. I think the bigger factor is probably inventions and the rate at which they get rolled out. And perhaps the UK has not been terribly good. We're quite good at inventing stuff, but then actually seeing it adopted in the UK and used, stuff that's invented here sometimes gets adopted in other countries quicker than it does here.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the productivity review is obviously a big deal. You did score that. It's a big part of the numbers that you ended up with. The one thing that the Conservative Party is getting irritated that you didn't score was the workers' rights legislation that's coming through. Just explain why you didn't do that this time.
We thought we would be. But what's happened during the course of this year is that there isn't a great deal more clarity now on some of the key things in that. There's lots of amendments I think have come down from the House. You probably know more about this than I do. A huge number of amendments are going to come back to the Commons. Quite how that'll play out, we're not sure. So some of the most significant parts of the bill, it's just unclear where it's going to end up. So rather than make, a judgment now, and we don't really know some of the key bits in it, we decided, well, we don't know what's coming. So wait till it's got some legislation.
And just as a matter of sort of procedure, if you were to attempt to score it next time, would concluded legislation be enough, or do you like to have sort of several months of evidence of how things are actually unfolding? How does it work?
I think it's a judgment we're going to have to make when we get there, in a way. And sometimes it's a grey area. The legislation has passed, but none of it's been implemented. But we're trying to take a view on what it will be like when it is implemented. But in a way, it's a necessary first step that at least there are some laws that are going to be implemented. And until you get to that stage, you can't even make a start on it, really. I think if the legislation had gone through and there's clarity on some of the key bits, I think we would then be in a position that we would make a judgment.
Very good. It must be quite sort of exciting being part of this process. You get a sneak preview of not only what they're going to do, but what they're considering they might do. How do you, on the committee, sort of get that information? You wait for the sort of the first round of proposals to come in, and
there are rounds. It's exactly what you said. I mean, there are rounds of proposals. Treasury pass on to us. We're thinking about, or the Chancellor of the government thinking about these potential things. We then make a judgment about, well, if this series of potential measures was implemented, this is what we think it does to revenue, to work, to savings, to investment, to GDP. And it's then an iterative process. And a key number, of course, between each stages of this iteration is, if we did this lot, what do you think the margin against our fiscal targets might be? And when you're trying to... hitting the fiscal target is a pretty difficult thing, because really you're looking at the difference between two enormous numbers. You're looking at the difference between government spending, which is about £1.5 trillion, and government tax revenue, which is a bit less than £1.5 trillion. So the fiscal target, or the main one, it's the current balance, that you're not in deficit on that. It's all about the difference between two enormous numbers.
Well, Simon Case, the former Cabinet Secretary, described it as trying to land a jumbo jet on a postage stamp, which...
Yeah, it's a bit that way. Yeah, which is why we're keen to stress at the OBR. Look, we could give you a central estimate of this thing, but the confidence that you'll be close to that is quite low. And I kind of liken it a bit to using a satnav. And we don't pretend at the OBR that we're an oracle. I kind of say to people, look, we're more like a satnav. So you set off from Swindon, and you're going to Glasgow, and you look at the thing, and it says it's going to take 7 hours and 41 minutes. Well, with probability 1, it's not going to be 7 hours and 41 minutes. And it'll change, as soon as you drive down to the end of the road, it's moved a bit one way or another, and suddenly it can jump up, suddenly it can jump down. And in a sense, when people say the OBR is always wrong, I say, yeah, of course we are. What do you expect? When you set off from Swindon, you're not going to get there 7 hours, 41 minutes later. Does that mean that a sat-nav is of no value whatsoever? Well, a lot of people seem to use them and find them quite useful.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I was going to turn to all this, but you must have been. What was the mood when it looked like they might slap 2p on income tax? Then you all must have been thinking, this is going to be a big deal. Well,
there's a whole range of measures, and not just in this budget, but in most budgets actually, of things that we're asked to consider. What would happen if we did this, and that was one amongst many, and it's always the case that only some fraction of those are actually in the final decision. And in a way, that's fair enough. That's the whole point of it being an iterative,
of course,
process.
But it must be. You must have all been looking at each other like, oh, well, this could be quite a big political moment if they do this.
Well, I think we're so. I'm not trying to dodge your question. There's so much work to be done in such a sort of relatively short period. It's more a question really of, right, so this is a potential measure. Have we got the tools to think about how you model this? With something like income tax, it's less difficult because obviously we've got a long history of changes in income tax. But sometimes you get a new measure. For example, the decision to increase the sort of mileage charge on electric vehicles. You can't look back. We've never had anything
never been
like
done before.
This. Yeah, never been done before. So you've got to try and sit down almost with a blank piece of paper, and with input from government departments, people in sort of the transport department, and try and work out, well, what might that do?
Yeah. Look, there's been a fair degree of criticism, from the trust budget onwards of some of the process involved here. I mean, arguably, the lengthy sort of build-up we had to this budget was partly about the Chancellor desperately going out making speeches about planning reform, about trade deals, about potential youth mobility schemes, in a desperate attempt to get you to sort of score supply-side changes. How much of that did you actually, in the end, incorporate?
Well, we've got a sort of threshold, which is that any measure that on our best central estimate gets you above it, either positive or negative, we'll explicitly allow for that in the forecast. But if it's a measure which at the specific 4-year ahead horizon doesn't look like it's moved GDP by 0.1%, either plus or minus, so that's
kind of your basic building block, is it?
Right. So if it looks like at 4 years down the road, it's just coming in under 0.1, either positive or negative, we'll say there isn't enough really that's reliable to go on to explicitly make an adjustment for that in the forecast. And some of the things that you mentioned, for example, the India trade deal, looked like, although it would in the longer run have some substantial effects and may well go above 0.1, since it's only just been ratified and it's going to be rolled out quite slowly, these things take time to have an impact, and it wasn't quite getting to the 0.1.
It's not enough in the forecast period, essentially.
Exactly right, yeah.
Some of the other sort of things people have been saying, I mean, William Hague wrote a column a while ago saying the 5-year horizons are not terribly helpful and government's effectively being forced into sort of short-term decision-making.
Yeah.
Do you, at the OBR, wish you had a sort of, maybe in addition to the 5-year, a 20-year horizon or something like that? Is there a case for a change to the mandate of how this is done?
I mean, we do produce between sort of the sort of five-year horizon that we look at. We do produce usually in the summer a report that looks at a much longer period. So that's a kind of 50-year ahead projection. So it's not that we don't ever think about stuff beyond 5 years. I mean, that publication, it's a big chunky publication, gets much less emphasis because it doesn't come alongside a budget and it doesn't come alongside a whole raft of budget decisions. So understandably, there's less attention gets paid to that. I think it's one of our more important publications. So it's not like we never look beyond 5 years.
But is there a case for putting it alongside it to kind of encourage governments to sort of make longer-term decisions?
I mean, one of the reasons we haven't done that is just the logistics of it, really. We've got 50 people in the OBR, and it's all hands to the deck, leading up to a budget. And if we then say, by the way, we're going to produce another report at the same time, which looks 50 years down the road, we haven't got enough people to do it. On the question of the 5 year thing, I mean, fair enough. What it means is that, a policy that we think is significant in boosting the supply potential of the economy, but it's a longer term thing, might not explicitly show up in the forecast. And that's frustrating, no doubt, for governments and frustrating for us sometimes. What we can do, although, maybe this is not first order importance, we can at least report sometimes, and we did it with various things that hadn't quite got over the line for explicitly counting them. We can say that, at the 4 or 5 year horizon, it's just under our threshold, but it will build up after that and we'll get to a more meaningful level. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't the government then just have a 10-year horizon or a 15-year or a 20-year horizon? And that's obviously for governments to decide. I think it would begin to strain the credibility of saying you're going to hit your target if, well, it's 20 years from now, so it's 4 general elections away. If we keep unchanged policies, the OBR is telling us we're going to be on the right side of some number. I think people would say, really? 20 years ahead? Well, you're not going to be around. So it's a kind of trade-off between what you don't want is, the target is 6 months ahead always, because then you're moving the tiller like every time the wind blows a bit. 20 years seems like, well, who's going to pay a whole lot of attention for that? 4 years, 5 years is a kind of balancing out between the two, really.
And needs to be tied to the electoral cycle, essentially. Governments need to be responsible for the decisions they make in time for...
Exactly. There's a kind of natural 4 or 5 years that comes out of that.
Just one final niche issue, immigration. Have you changed at all how you approach that? I mean, there's been a lot of criticism for saying, look, OBR and the Treasury have constantly just scored this as an unalloyed economic good. A lot of people on the centre-right think that's not correct. And it's obviously, there's a political debate around that.
Yeah.
Has the economics changed at all? Or?
Well, I think the economics are that if more people come into the country, and a substantial proportion, not all of them, but a proportion of them are working, aggregate GDP, which is not a very good measure of the quality of life of people in this country, which should always be GDP per person, aggregate GDP is going to be higher, almost certainly. But that's not a very good measure of, in a sense, the quality of life, the standard of living of people in the UK, nor is it necessarily a positive for the fiscal outlook, particularly if you look further down the road, because it depends then on what kind of earnings people who come into the country generate. How much tax do they pay? Do they start using the welfare system? How many dependents they come with them? Now, in the short run, people have got rather limited access to the welfare system. And typically when they come into the UK, the majority of people are relatively young, so they're a long way off to the pension age, and they're of what you might call working age. So it's likely that in a purely fiscal sense, which is a very narrow measure of whether it's a good thing, more immigration probably is beneficial purely fiscally. The bigger question is, what does it do to the quality of life and standard of living of people in the country? That's much more ambiguous. And if you take a longer horizon, where people who might arrive of working age, but they get older, they have kids, they become eligible for welfare, that's a different question again. And I hope we've tried to be clearer on that in recent years.
Is there not a case for just scrapping general GDP and focusing on GDP per capita?
Well, I think for welfare judgments, for what is happening to the quality of life of people and their standard of living, absolutely, no question at all. I mean, our role is less to make those judgments, but more the sort of narrowly defined one, which is, and it's laid out in the legislation that set up the OBR, what is the fiscal outlook and what are the chances that the government hit whatever fiscal targets it has?
Because the argument would be that effectively having the system almost forces the government to adopt policies to tick the economic box that may have politically negative effects potentially.
Well, but I think the direction of travel, in the much more recent period is counter to that. I mean, obviously we've got much tougher rules on visas now, and bringing independence. That's beginning to show up really quite sharply in the numbers, which are coming down a lot, and that's now in our forecast at much lower numbers.
At the risk of trying to summarise this pithily, I think your argument is that the OBR may be the worst of all systems apart from all the other ones. Is that broadly correct?
That's not bad. Or another way of putting it is, a wonky satnav might be better than having no idea at all how long it takes to get from Swindon to Glasgow.
David Miles, thank you very much.
Thank you.